I have been asked to set the record straight before I die. That is the polite way the Historical Commission phrased it, and I appreciate the courtesy, because the blunter version is that they want my testimony while I can still give it. And everyone in this room knows the clock is running. I am 71 years old. I have spent 43 of those years in one form of service or another to the Terran Expeditionary Intelligence Directorate, which is the kind of organization whose name sounds bureaucratic until you understand what it actually does. I was present at the decloak of the T's Relentless Harbinger in the Cateran Passage on the 14th of March 2231. I was 38 years old. I have not spoken publicly about what I saw that day in anything more than the approved summary. And the approved summary, as anyone who has read it knows, is approximately 1/3 of the truth. Let me start where it actually starts, which is not on the bridge of the Harbinger. It starts a decade earlier in a waiting room. I was 28, newly assigned to the Throne Liaison Office, which was the Directorate's polite fiction of a diplomatic presence inside the Galactic Throne's observer framework. The throne was, and I will use the past tense deliberately, a council of 11 species bound by a treaty of mutual recognition, shared navigational rights, dating back, by their reckoning, 460 years. They had built something that mostly worked. Not a government, exactly. More like a standing agreement among large families who had learned not to shoot each other in the hallway. The treaty had corridors, inspection protocols, joint patrol frameworks, and a dispute resolution chamber that moved at the pace of a geological age. They were proud of it. They had reason to be. Each of the 11 species had arrived at the treaty through some version of the same historical lesson, which is that unconstrained competition among capable civilizations tends to produce outcomes that the survivors find instructive in retrospect. The throne was what you built after enough of those lessons. It was slow, procedural, resistant to revision, and it had, on balance, kept the peace in the navigational corridors it governed for 460 years. That is not nothing. I have never pretended otherwise. Humanity had been knocking on the door of that framework for 6 years when I arrived at the liaison office. We had fulfilled the correct requests. We had attended the preliminary hearings. We had sent 3 rounds of delegations, each more senior than the last, each received with what the throne called respectful consideration, which meant the matter was tabled for further review. The Directorate's internal assessment, which I read during my first week, was straightforward. The throne was not refusing us. The throne was delaying us while it decided what category of problem we were. Were we a minor species seeking associate status? Were we a potential navigational hazard? Were we something larger? Something that didn't fit the existing taxonomy? The Council had a file on every species in the framework. They were building one on us. They were being careful, which was their way, and careful took time. What nobody in the throne expected was that during the years they were being careful, we were not standing still. I met Kale Vos Shira for the first time in that waiting room. He was the senior military attaché of the Chiron Compact, which was one of the 11 member species of the throne. Not the largest, not the most powerful, but the one whose fleet doctrine had won them the most respect inside the Council's military committee. The Chiron were a tall people, gray-scaled, with eyes set wide on their heads in a way that gave them a visual arc that our neurologists found genuinely unsettling when they first studied the physiology. They processed movement the way birds do, fast, precise, nothing escaping the peripheral frame. Combat doctrine built on that biology was formidable, and the Chiron had been fighting other people's wars as contractors and allied forces for 150 years before the throne absorbed them into the formal framework. They were not soft. Vos Shira had been in uniform for 40 years when I met him. He moved like someone who had made a study of patience and found it useful. We were both waiting for the same pre-session briefing. The room was the kind of institutional space that exists in any large multilateral framework. Pale walls, recessed lighting calibrated to no one species in particular, chairs that were technically functional for all of us, and comfortable for none. He looked at me with that wide gaze and said, in Standard, which he spoke better than I did at the time, that he had been reading our navigational filings. I told him I was glad someone had. He said they were interesting. I asked him what he meant by interesting. He said, "You are not filing what you actually have, are you?" I told him that was a significant inference from navigational data. He smiled, which, on a Chiron, looks like a slight hardening of the jaw muscles rather than anything the human face would produce, and said, "I have been reading military capability disclosures for 38 years. I know the shape of what a species chooses to leave out. That was the beginning of 10 years of occasional careful conversation between KL Voshira and myself. I want to be precise about what that relationship was and was not. It was not a friendship in any sentimental sense. It was a mutual professional assessment conducted across a table, in waiting rooms, in the corridors of the Throne's observer facility on Kadiran Station, in brief exchanges at the margins of sessions. Neither of us could fully influence. He was doing his job, was doing mine, but he was the most honest interlocutor I found inside the Throne's framework during the years, and I valued that in the way you value a clean instrument when everything else around you is inexact. Over those 10 years, Oshira filed 9 formal assessments with the Throne's military committee regarding the Terran expeditionary capacity. I have read all 9. The first one, filed 18 months after we met, was measured and evidentiary, a careful reading of our navigational filings, our declared ship movements, the tonnage curves implied by our fuel consumption data, the patterns in our personnel rotations, and a detailed technical analysis of 3 anomalous sensor returns that Chiron patrol vessels had logged in the outer Kadiran region in the preceding year. He concluded that the Terran fleet was significantly larger than our disclosures suggested, that our stealth capability was likely a full generation ahead of anything the Throne had successfully detected or categorized, and that the Council's working assumption of a mid-tier emerging species seeking conventional associate status was almost certainly wrong. The military committee thanked him for the assessment and returned it to file. The second, filed 2 years later, was sharper. He had new data. A more recent encounter in the Dreth corridor where a Chiron patrol vessel had briefly lost contact with a Terran ship that should, by known physics and the operational parameters of the Throne's detection suite, have been continuously visible at that range. The ship had not been there. Then it had been there. The patrol commander had filed a formal anomaly report, which the Throne's technical review board had classified as sensor malfunction, attributable to a known interference pattern in the Dreth corridor's ionization layer. Voshira did not agree with that classification. He had taken the raw sensor logs, compared them against the ionization data, and laid out in the quiet, systematic prose that was characteristic of all his best work exactly why the malfunction explanation did not survive. Contact with the numbers. He said, "Whatever the Terrans are running on that class of vessel is not sensor malfunction. We are not seeing them when they do not wish to be seen, and they have been operating inside the corridor framework for years." The military committee thanked him for the assessment and returned it to file. I am not going to go through all 9 in detail. Pattern was the same. Each assessment was better sourced, more detailed, more urgent in its conclusions, and built systematically on the ones before it. By the 4th assessment, he had established a methodology for reading the negative space in the Throne sensor logs, the places where a detectable object should have been and was not. He were as informative as a direct contact return, if you were willing to look at them. The 6th assessment included technical reconstruction of 3 probable Terran stealth corridors running through what the Throne's charts, classified as unoccupied space, extrapolated from fuel consumption patterns, resupply intervals, and the timing of known port calls at Terran stations bordering the Throne's framework. It was the kind of analysis that both technical rigor and the willingness to follow an inference all the way to its uncomfortable conclusion. He was good at both. The 7th assessment, filed 4 years before the Harbinger event, used the word danger 3 times in the body text and once in the summary, which was not a word Voshira used lightly, and which in 9 years of reading his work, I had never seen him use at all before that filing. The 9th assessment, filed 6 months before the Harbinger event, was the most direct document I have read from inside the Throne's institutional framework in 40 years of handling such material. He recommended that the Council immediately open direct bilateral negotiations with humanity regarding mutual transparency, non-escalation protocols, and a formal acknowledgement that the existing detection framework was inadequate to the actual operational situation in the corridors they both used. He attached a 14-point technical annex. He noted, in the covering letter, in language that remained perfectly professional, and was nonetheless about as pointed as Throne internal correspondence ever got, he had been raising versions of this concern for 8 years, and that the window for an orderly process was narrowing. The military committee thanked him for the assessment and returned it to file. I want you to understand what that decade felt like from where I was sitting. I was not filing assessments the way Voss Shira was. My role was observation, collation, and the transmission of information back to the directorate, and what I was transmitting was a picture of an institution that had built its identity around the idea that it could see everything that mattered in the space it governed. And that was now, very slowly, beginning to understand that there was a category of thing it could not see. That is a particular kind of institutional vertigo. It does not announce itself loudly. It arrives as a reluctance to examine certain data sets, preference for certain interpretive frameworks over others, a tendency to receive careful, well-sourced assessments and find them interesting without acting on them, because acting on them would require revising conclusions that the institution had been operating on for years. And revision is expensive. Carefully managed inaction costs nothing in the short term. The Throne was not stupid. The 11 species on that council had survived a combined total of something like 12,000 years of civilized history, which means they had individually and collectively been through the kinds of tests that kill civilizations that get things badly wrong. They had earned their careful processes. They were slow because fast had cost them, historically, in ways they had not forgotten. The problem was that carefulness, when applied to a new variable that does not fit the existing model, can look identical to avoidance from the outside, and more importantly, it can feel identical to the institution from the inside. You go through the same motions. You review the same filings with the same care. You file the same courteous responses. Process is indistinguishable from functioning. What has changed is that the process is no longer connected to the thing it was designed to do, which is incorporate new information and update the institution's picture of reality accordingly. Voss Shira understood this. He said it to me, in various forms over the course of that decade. He said it to his own council in 9 formal assessments. It changed nothing. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes from being heard correctly by the wrong people for too many years. I recognized it in him. I was, in a smaller way, acquainted with the same variety. The inspection passage arrangement that led to the Harbinger event was established 4 months before it happened. The Throne is as a confidence-building measure, a joint corridor transit with Terran vessels operating under an agreed navigational protocol, with Throne observer ships present at specified intervals and separation distances. It was framed as a step toward the formal associate status hearings that had been pending for 3 years. The language of the proposal described it as an opportunity to build mutual familiarity through structured co-navigation of the shared corridor framework. That was the diplomatic framing. The operational reality from the Throne's side was that they wanted to see what Terran vessels look like at close range, under controlled conditions, in a situation where both sides had agreed to the parameters in advance. The Directorate had agreed to the arrangement. I had been part of the team that negotiated the specific parameters, which meant I had read every draft of the protocol document and every comment the Throne's legal review office had inserted, removed, or modified before the final version was signed. The protocol specified the separation distance, the transit route, the communication frequencies, the observation periods, and a long list of specific actions that neither side would take during the transit without prior notification. It was a thorough document, as these things go. What I knew and the Throne did not was that the relentless Harbinger had been assigned to the transit specifically because of what it was, not because anyone at the Directorate intended to provoke an incident or to violate the terms of an agreement we had negotiated in good faith. The reasoning was clean and it was correct. The throne had 9 formal assessments sitting in its military committee files. Ace. The associate status hearings could not be conducted honestly, while the throne was operating on a model of Terran capability that was significantly out of alignment with reality. If the Council was going to take the next step toward a functional relationship with humanity, it needed to have an accurate picture of what that relationship actually involved. The Harbinger was the accurate picture. The transit protocol was the controlled setting. The question was whether the throne would look at what was in front of it. What the protocol did not prohibit, because no one on the throne's drafting team had thought to specify it, was any variation from the agreed separation distance between the Terran vessels and the observer flotilla during the transit, beyond the minimum the throne had requested for its own comfort. They had specified a floor. They had not specified a ceiling, or rather, they had not specified that the floor was also a ceiling. In 11 species and 460 years of multilateral treaty drafting, apparently no one had felt the need to write that particular sentence, because no species in the throne's operational experience could have varied from a specified separation in the direction that would make the gap smaller without being detected in the process. I requested assignment as the embedded intelligence observer on the Harbinger's transit. The request was approved without comment. Took that to mean my superiors understood exactly what I was asking to watch. I boarded the relentless Harbinger at Terran Station Verada 6 days before the scheduled transit. She was a stealth cruiser of the Relentless class, was at that time the most capable operational hull in the Terran fleet. The one whose existence the Directorate was least interested in confirming to external parties, and the class that Boss Fashira's 4th and 5th assessments had hypothesized with an accuracy that had caused some discussion in the Directorate's analytical division when those filings came through. She was 230 meters long. From the outside, in standard visible spectrum observation, she was not immediately impressive. A long, angular hull with compound angle geometry that caught light poorly, a profile designed to return minimal signal across every wavelength the throne's detection framework used, with the kind of surface treatment and internal architecture that made the sensor signature of a 230-meter warship resemble the noise floor of empty space. She had been operating in the Kadiran region for 14 months under the throne's navigational awareness, correctly filed, visible when the protocol required visibility and otherwise not. Captain was a woman named Rena Cavalcanti, 44 years old, 20 of them in active fleet command, the last 6 in stealth operations running profiles that, as far as the rest of the galaxy was concerned, were not happening. She had the kind of personal economy that the Harbinger's operational profile seemed to select for. Words used sparingly, decisions made cleanly, nothing wasted on communication that action could accomplish better. We did not talk much during those 6 days. We had dinner in the officers' mess twice. She asked me, at the first dinner, what I expected to see at Kadiran. I told her I expected to see the throne's observers decide what they believed. She looked at me for a moment and said that was a reasonable answer. Then she asked for the salt shaker and moved on to the logistics review that had been her reason for sitting down in the first place. She was not cold. I want to be clear about that, because accounts of Cavalcante sometimes describe her that way, and it mistakes precision for coldness. She cared about her crew in the way that a competent commander cares. Not demonstratively, but absolutely, in the sense that everything she did was aimed at bringing them home, with the mission accomplished and the hull intact. What she did not do was perform that care for an audience. Her crew knew what she was because they had served under her, not because she told them. I found her presence steadying in the way that very few people I have met in 40 years of this work have managed. She knew what the Harbinger was. She knew what it could do. She had no anxiety about either fact, which when you are standing on the observation deck of a ship about to materialize, at 900 meters from an armed multilateral observer flotilla, is the most useful quality a commanding officer can have. The throne's observer flotilla met us at the entrance to the Kadiran Passage at 0600 on the 14th. 4 ships, an Orinth diplomatic cruiser running as the senior presence, 2 Chiron light patrol vessels which I took as Vashirashir's specific contribution to the observation party, and a Vithani Council transport that was serving as the formal platform for the senior throne observers. 14 observers in total, representing 7 of the 11 species. The observation was their protocol requirement, and we had agreed to it without condition. Provost Shira was on the Vithani transport. I had known he would be. He had specifically requested assignment to the observation party, told me that he knew, if not the precise nature of what was coming, then the broad shape of it. He had written 9 assessments. He understood what the Harbinger class was better than any other non-Terran analyst alive. The transit was scheduled to take 11 hours. Harbinger and a second Terran vessel, the lighter patrol cruiser T's Kadiran Watch, would move through the passage under the agreed protocol, with the throne observer ships maintaining a parallel course at a separation of roughly 4,000 kilometers. This was the confidence-building arrangement. 4,000 kilometers is a comfortable distance in deep space. You are close enough to observe with precision. You are not close enough to be mistaken for a threat approach. The throne had specified that separation in the protocol documents, and we had agreed to it, and we had done so knowing that the protocol document contained the gap. At hour 7 of the transit, at a point in the Kadiran Passage that Cavalcante had selected, on the basis of navigational and operational criteria she had not briefed me on, I was on the Harbinger's secondary observation deck. The passage at that point was relatively narrow by deep space standards, an asteroid field to port, the outer debris ring of a mid-sized gas giant to starboard. The navigable channel between them approximately 30,000 kilometers wide. The gas giant itself was visible through the observation port, an amber-brown body that dominated the lower quarter of the frame, and through its light, across the channel in long warm bands that did something to the color of the asteroid field, turning the field's grays and tans into ochres and coppers. It was, in a purely visual sense, one of the more beautiful things I have seen in 4 decades of deep space service, and I remember noticing that, and immediately filing it away, because it was not the thing I was there to observe. The throne observer ships were 4,000 kilometers off our port beam. The Kadiran Watch was running ahead of us by 2,000 meters, holding position and pace, doing precisely what the protocol said it should do. Everything on every readout and every channel was exactly as the protocol described. Cavalcante came on the internal channel at 9 minutes past 1400 hours, ship time. She did not announce an operation or read a briefing note or provide any context. She simply said to the entire crew, "Stand by." 2 words, flat. Then the channel went quiet. I have reconstructed the throne observer's experience of the next 4 minutes from the testimony of 3 of the teen observers present, gathered during the 2 years following the event through a combination of formal interviews and less formal conversations. I was not aboard their ships. I can only tell you what I witnessed from the Harbinger's secondary observation deck and what those 3 observers subsequently described to me when I asked them directly. From the Harbinger's perspective, it was seamless. The ship ran through its decloak sequence over 90 seconds. A calibrated, controlled emergence into the full sensor spectrum of every detection system the Throne Observer flotilla carried. Process was not violent or sudden. It was a systematic step-down through the stealth envelope, from full suppression to partial to none, executed in precise intervals that had been calibrated for exactly this kind of controlled reveal. The geometry was precise. We came out at 900 meters from the lead throne vessel, not 4,000 kilometers. 900 meters. I watched it on the secondary observation deck's external feed. The gas giant's amber light was coming in at a low angle across the passage, painting the port side of the observer flotilla in the warm color that the gas giant produced at this distance, making their hulls look almost burnished, in a way that was somewhat at odds with the situation unfolding around them. Then the Harbinger's full sensor return filled the feed. Not visible light first. The cascade of active sensor emissions from the throne ships, as every detection system they carried, fired simultaneously at the thing that had just appeared 900 meters from their bow. The volume of that electromagnetic cascade, rendered as audio on the deck's environmental system, was like standing inside a bell in the moment a hammer hits it. It was every sensor the flotilla owned, all at once, all aimed at us. The Harbinger did not move. I want to be precise about that, because it is the center of the whole thing. We did not accelerate. We did not alter heading. We did not power up weapons or charge any offensive system. We did not transmit any signal beyond the standard navigational transponder that had been running continuously throughout the transit. We did not make any sound, on any frequency, directed at the observer flotilla. Cavalcanti had taken the Harbinger out of stealth at 900 meters from the lead vessel of an 11-species council observation party that had not known we were there, and then she held us exactly where we were. Running lights on. Transponder broadcasting correctly, as it always had. Crew at their stations doing their jobs. The secondary observation deck, quiet enough that I could hear the low-frequency vibration of the Harbinger's drives, which was the only indication that we were a ship, with engines rather than a very large object sitting in space. Someone behind me, a junior signals analyst whose name I never learned, because she transferred off the Harbinger 2 months later, asked in a low voice whether the observers were responding on the hailing frequency. The answer came back from the communications station at the front of the deck. Not yet. The throne observers were silent for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I know the precise time because the Harbinger's sensor log records it continuously, and I have read that log many times over the past 30 years. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. From the moment the Harbinger's sensor return first appeared on the observer flotilla's systems to the moment the transmission came from their formation. 4 minutes and 17 seconds in which 14 observers on 4 ships, 7 species, each with its own perceptual biology and command culture, were processing the same piece of information. A vessel they had not detected, operating in an inspection corridor they had designed and specified and agreed to in a protocol they had drafted, had materialized at a distance from which it could have destroyed every ship in their formation, without any of them having the capability to respond. And it had done nothing. It had simply arrived. It was simply there. Holding position, at 900 meters, in the amber light of the gas giant, the relentless Harbinger was 230 meters of armored hull, gun ports, antenna spires, weld-scared plating, and weathered exhaust cowlings, and it was waiting with a patience that I recognized, from the inside, as the same patience Cavalcanti brought to everything she did. The first transmission from the observer flotilla came from the Vithani transport, the official throne platform. It was a standard navigational hailing signal, name, registry, current heading, operational status. The format was exactly what the protocol specified. For all navigational communications during the transit, the tone that the Commission's linguists later analyzed in detail was what they described as procedurally correct, but vocalically atypical, which is their careful professional way of saying that the individual sending it was maintaining the required format while producing the vocal characteristics of someone in a significant physiological stress state. Every Vithani word was in the right place. The voice behind them was not. Cavalcanti responded on the same frequency. Standard navigational reply matching the format exactly. Name, TS, Relentless Harbinger, Registry, Terran Expeditionary Fleet, Heading 034 Mark II, consistent with agreed transit protocol, operational status, nominal. She added one sentence that was not part of the standard navigational format, not required by the protocol, and not scripted by anyone in the directorate, as far as I am aware, she said. We are proceeding on schedule. We are proceeding on schedule. I have thought about those 4 words more times than I can count across 30 years, and I have never found a better description of what they did. They were not a threat. They contained no hostile language, no claim of superiority, no statement of capability, no reference to the gap between what the protocol had specified and what had just happened. They were a factual report of current operational status, and they carried, in their complete plainness, in the absolute absence of anything performative or explanatory, every piece of information the throne needed to understand what it was dealing with. We had been on schedule when we were invisible. We were on schedule now that we were not. The schedule had always been ours, in the only sense that mattered. which was that our understanding of what the corridor contained was accurate and complete, and the Throne's understanding had been neither. The ship that had materialized at 900 meters and reported nominal operational status was not doing so in distress or in anger or in demonstration. It was doing so because that was what the situation was. The transit was proceeding normally. From the Harbinger's perspective, nothing remarkable had occurred. The observer flotilla maintained its position. We maintained ours. Cavalcanti held the Harbinger at 900 meters for 18 minutes, during which the Throne observer ships produced 7 more transmissions on various frequencies, 2 more navigational hails, 1 request for technical specification data that we acknowledged and noted would be addressed through the standard bilateral process, and 4 others that I will not characterize in detail because portions of that communication log are still restricted. Then, without announcement, Cavalcanti resumed the agreed transit separation, increasing the distance back to 4,000 kilometers, with the same precision with which she had closed it, and the Qadiran watch, which had not broken formation throughout, adjusted to match. The remaining 4 hours of the transit proceeded in complete silence from the observer flotilla. I did not sleep that night. What I was processing was not satisfaction. I want to be honest about that, because in the years since, there have been accounts of the Harbinger event, written by people who were not there, and who have treated it as a moment of uncomplicated triumph, demonstration, humanity showing its hand. It was not that, or it was not only that. It was accurate and it was necessary, and it changed the trajectory of the relationship between humanity and the Throne's member species, in ways that were, on balance, beneficial to everyone involved, including the species that found the change hardest to absorb. But none of that is the same as satisfaction. What I was lying there thinking about, in the dim light of the Harbinger's crew quarters, was Vos Shira. He was on the Vethani transport. He had been 600 meters further from the Harbinger than the Oranth cruiser that was the lead vessel. He had watched the cascade of sensor emissions from his formation's detection systems, knowing as he watched what those systems were responding to, because he had been telling his council for 9 years what those systems would find in exactly this situation if they ever looked. He had been right. He had always been right. And now the council had finally looked, not because of his 9 assessments, because a Terran captain had held a 230-meter warship at 900 meters and waited. I have never been able to decide whether that was justice or something considerably less comfortable. The Throne Observer Flotilla returned to Qadiran Station the following day. The official communique from the Throne Secretariat, released 48 hours after the transit, described the passage as successful, and noted that certain technical parameters had been reviewed and would inform future protocol discussions. It was 5 sentences long and contained no word that was technically untrue and no sentence that bore any relationship to the operational reality of what had occurred. The Directorate received a formal request for a bilateral technical meeting. Within the week, which was the fastest the Throne had ever responded to any Terran communication since first contact, and which the Directorate's liaison team read as the accurate indicator of the Council's internal state that it was. I was back on Qadiran Station within 10 days, officially on a routine liaison rotation. What I was actually doing was reading the internal pressure along the Throne's fault lines before it settled into whatever shape it was going to take, permanently. What I found was a fracture, moving through the Council in the way that structural fractures move. Not loudly, not suddenly, but in directions that had been predetermined by the stresses that had been accumulating for years. The Throne did not shout. It had never operated by shouting. It deliberated. It convened working groups. It produced memoranda. It formed subcommittees to review the findings of working groups and produce revised memoranda for full Council consideration. And, through all of that process, running underneath the procedural machinery, like a current, that the procedure was never quite fast enough to redirect. The alignment of the 11 species was shifting in ways that were slow and structural and, by the time I arrived to observe them, irreversible. One faction, larger, initially, wanted to interpret the Harbinger event as a protocol violation. This was the position of the Oranth and Vethani Council delegations, with cautious support from 3 other species whose committee votes I tracked through my contact in the Secretariat. It had the attraction of requiring no fundamental revision of anything. If the Terrans had violated the transit protocol, the throne's framework remained intact. Damaged, perhaps, requiring adjustment, but intact. The violation could be addressed through the throne's standard dispute mechanisms, which were well developed, because they had been used many times over 4 centuries. The situation could be managed. The technical problem with this position was that the transit protocol had not been violated in any language that the document's actual text supported. Voss Shira had pointed this out in the first internal technical session, which I know because 2 people who were present gave me detailed accounts. He had laid out, with the same methodical precision that characterized all his work, exactly why the protocol's separation language specified a minimum and not a range, and why any legal reading of the document that converted a floor into a ceiling would not survive a challenge through the throne's own dispute framework. He was correct, and the Legal Review Office subsequently confirmed it in writing. Confirmation was quietly placed in committee file rather than circulated. He had also said something else, I was told. He had said that the council was looking in the wrong place. He said, "The violation you are searching for is not in the protocol document. If you wish to conduct a useful review of the Qadiran transit, the document you should examine is the accumulation of technical assessments this committee has received and returned to file over the preceding 9 years, beginning with the first navigational anomaly report from the Dreth corridor. The transit produced no new information about the Terran fleet. It confirmed information this committee has held and declined to act upon for nearly a decade. Question for this council is not what the Terrans did in the passage. The question is what we have been doing, or not doing, with what we knew." He was not thanked for this contribution. But the session did not simply move on from it either. The subsequent sessions were noticeably different in character from the ones I had been observing for the previous decade. Less settled, more careful with language, as if the council was aware that it was walking on ground it was no longer certain of. Over the following 6 weeks, I watched the throne's internal cohesion move in a direction it had never moved in 460 years of operation. The bilateral technical meeting was held and produced an agreement to establish a joint technical commission, which was progress in the sense that establishing a commission is better than establishing nothing. The corridor protocols were revised with new language that was more explicit about what the throne's framework was capable of detecting and what fell outside those parameters, which was significant as an acknowledgement, even if it changed nothing about the underlying operational reality. The associate status hearings were rescheduled on a revised framework that reflected, on paper, a more accurate understanding of what a relationship with humanity actually involved. None of this addressed the central question. Was not about protocol language or technical commission charters or hearing schedules. The central question was whether an institution built on the premise that it could govern the space it claimed could survive accurate contact with the information that its ability to see that space was substantially incomplete. The protocol revisions were an attempt to update the premise. What they could not was restore the confidence that had previously allowed the premise to go unexamined. Voss Shira requested a private meeting with me on the 22nd day after the transit. We met in one of the small conference rooms off the main observer deck at Qadiran Station. Pale walls, 1 table, 2 chairs, no recording equipment, which is why it gets used for the conversations that don't appear in the official log. He came in and sat down and looked at me for a long moment with that wide Chiron gaze. Then he said, "You were on the Harbinger." I said yes. He said, "It was your side's call to do it that way. Specific selection of that hull for the transit." I said, "I wasn't in a position to discuss the operational decision." He said he understood that. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table rather than at me, which was unusual enough for him that I noticed it. Then he said, "I filed 9 assessments in 9 years. Each one was received. I was thanked each time." He paused for long enough that I thought he might be finished. Then he said, "I want to know whether any of it reached anyone on your side who made use of it. I told him the truth was that I could not speak to what the directorate had done with his work, and that I would not be truthful if I claimed to know. But I could tell him that the assessments had been read by people who understood what they were, and that in my professional judgment they were not wasted work. He accepted that without any particular expression. Then he was quiet again, and I could see him deciding something which was also unusual. He was not ordinarily someone who deliberated visibly. He said, "I am going to tell you what I have not put in any of the 9 assessments, because it is not the kind of thing that belongs in a formal technical filing." I told him I was listening. He said, "I did not warn my counsel because I was afraid of your species. The assessments were not threat assessments in the conventional sense, though I know that is how the committee treated them. I warned them because I could see what we were becoming." He stopped, and then said it more precisely. "What we had already become without noticing, an institution that receives accurate information and chooses the interpretation that requires the least disruption, is an institution that has stopped governing and started managing its own continuity. It is a different activity. It looks the same from the outside for a long time, then it doesn't." He looked at me, he said, "Whatever happens in the next formal session of the council, the thing that will determine whether the throne survives as a meaningful body is not what it decides about your species. It is whether it can tell the difference between what it knows and what it has chosen to believe." I have not been able to get the committee to see that as a separate question. I do not expect to succeed in the next session either. I asked him what he thought was going to happen. He looked at me for a long time. He said, "I think several things are going to end." He was correct. The formal throne session convened 31 days after the transit. I was not in the chamber. My access did not extend that far, and that is as it should be. I had a contact inside the Secretariat who transmitted me the session record in near real time, and I read it in my quarters at the station while the deliberation ran for 9 hours. I am going to describe the relevant portions because the official summary that was released afterward was accurate in its facts and incomplete in its weight, and the historical record should have more than what was officially released. The session opened with a motion from the Orinth delegation to formally censure the Terran Expeditionary Fleet for the transit variation, and to demand a full technical disclosure of stealth capabilities as a precondition for any further associate status hearings. It was seconded by Vethani. Discussion was opened. Voshira took the floor for the Chiron Compact after the third speaker. He did not speak for long. I have the transcript, and I have read it many times. The core of it is 3 pages of a 14-page document. He said that the motion was backwards. He said the council was proposing to demand transparency from a species that had just demonstrated, in a controlled and non-hostile transit, that its actual capabilities were substantially beyond what the council's assessment framework could measure. Demanding transparency from a party you cannot verify is not a negotiating position, he said. It is a statement of the gap between the authority you believe you hold and the authority you can actually exercise. He said the throne had received 9 formal technical assessments over 9 years indicating this exact situation, and that each of those assessments had been returned to file without action, and that the cost of those 9 non-decisions was now a matter of record in the gap between what the council's chart showed and what had appeared at 900 meters in the Cateran Passage He's. He said the question before the council was not what the Terrans had done during the transit. The question was whether the council was willing to build a relationship with a species it could not fully see, or whether it preferred to maintain the operational fiction that its existing framework remained adequate. He noted that there was a third option, to decline to examine either question directly, but he did not recommend it, because questions of this kind did not go away when they were ignored. He had, he said, some direct experience with that dynamic, which is, he said, one warmth is the part the official summary omitted. He said, I have spent a decade telling this council what is in the dark. The council chose not to look. The Terrans did not put themselves in the dark. We put them there by preferring the version of events in which we could see everything that mattered. What sat 900 meters off our bow in the Cateran Passage was not a provocation. It was an answer to a question we have been refusing to ask. Question is, what is humanity? The answer is now in the record. My recommendation is that we read it. The motion passed 7 votes to 4. The Sharon Compact voted against. Voshira left the chamber. The Compact's delegation left with him. Within 72 hours, the Compact had formally withdrawn its fleet from the Throne's Joint Patrol Framework, citing what their communique described as an irreconcilable divergence in strategic assessment. Iman. The withdrawal was not a declaration of hostility toward the Throne or toward humanity. It was quieter than that. It was one compact of 460 years, losing one of its members, because that member had concluded the institution could no longer tell. The difference between what it knew and what it wished were true. And in the world I had been living in for the past decade, that distinction was the only one that mattered. I was recalled to Terran Station Varada at the end of the 8th week. My rotation at Cataran was over. I left on a standard transport which I shared with a Vethani technical delegation, and an Oranth commercial attaché talked to me for most of the journey about mineral extraction rights in the Outer Passage. He did not mention the 14th of March. Did not bring it up. I did not speak to Voshira again for 4 years. When we did speak, it was at the margins of a navigational conference on neutral ground. The kind of venue where professional contact across a more complicated political landscape was tacitly permissible. He had retired from active command 2 years after the withdrawal and was working in an advisory capacity for a Sharon academic institution. He was older in the way that Sharon officers who have carried a long operational burden tend to age. The scale patterns more pronounced, the wide gaze more settled, the patience more visible as a chosen thing rather than a natural one. He said, "How long did the Throne last?" I told him the formal framework was technically still extant, but that 3 species had moved to observer status rather than active membership in the previous 3 years, and that the Joint Patrol protocols had not been operationally exercised in 18 months. He nodded. He said, "It will not recover. Not because of your people, because of what it chose at the Qadiran session. A body that votes to avoid a question that the evidence demands it answer has made a decision about what kind of institution it is. The Compact could not remain part of that decision." I asked him if he regretted what he had recommended. He thought about it for long enough that I knew it was not a rhetorical consideration. He said, "I read the 9 assessments that were returned to file. I regret 10 years of clear evidence being treated as an inconvenience to be managed. I do not regret the withdrawal. An institution that cannot update itself when the information requires it is not an institution I can serve. The Compact withdrew because I recommended it, and I recommended it because I would rather build something outside a failure than maintain the appearance of something that had already ended. The Galactic Throne as a functioning unified body ceased to exist in any operationally meaningful sense approximately 8 years after the Qadiran event. The dissolution was a process rather than a moment. Bilateral agreements replacing multilateral ones, species migrating out of the joint framework into direct relationships with humanity, and with each other on revised terms. The treaty structure gradually emptying of operational content, as the parties that had made it function found they could accomplish more outside it than inside. Some of those species managed the transition well, some did not. The process was on balance better for most of the species involved than the alternative of an institution's continuing to function as a governing body, while being unable to see a significant portion of the space it claimed to govern. That is the honest assessment. The Sharon Compact had a bilateral framework with the Terran Expeditionary Fleet within 2 years of the withdrawal. Voshira had recommended that too. He was right about that as well. What I want the record to hold, and what I have been asked to provide for this commission, because the documents cannot hold it by themselves, is the thing the official summary of the Harbinger event does not contain. The official summary describes a navigational transit, notes a variation in separate parameters, observes that subsequent protocol discussions were conducted, and records the outcome as a development in the first contact relationship building process. All of that is accurate. None of it captures what I watched from the secondary observation deck of a ship that knew precisely what it was. What I saw was a vessel that had spent 14 months operating in a corridor that the throne's framework was supposed to govern, doing so with precision and without concealment from any detection system capable of finding it, and that had come to the agreed inspection transit ready to be seen in full rather than in part. Not as a demonstration, not as a provocation, but because accurate information was the only foundation on which a functional relationship could be built, and the throne had been working with inaccurate information for too long. What I saw was a crew at their stations doing their work with the composure of people who had prepared thoroughly and believed in what the operation was for. What I saw was a captain whose forward transmission, "We are proceeding on schedule," contained the complete answer to every throne the throne had been carefully not asking for 9 years. And what I saw, which is the part I have carried longest, was the knowledge that the man who had done the most to bring the throne to an accurate understanding of this situation was on one of the ships, 4,000 kilometers away, watching the thing he had predicted materialize exactly where and how he had said it would, and that his counsel had thanked him 9 times and done nothing. And that the moment of being proved comprehensively right was happening too late to change the institution he had been trying to save. Voss Shira is in his late 80s now, by Sharon reckoning. He has written a book. I have not read it, but I understand it covers the throne years in detail, and I expect it to be accurate, because he was always accurate. I am 71 years old. I have done my job for 43 years. I have been asked to set the record straight, and this is what the record is. In the Qadiran Passage on the 14th of March 2231, a Terran stealth cruiser came out of darkness at 900 meters from an 11th species observer flotilla and waited. It did not threaten, it did not demand, it did not explain. It arrived on schedule and it waited. And in that waiting, in the patience of a ship that knew what it was and had nothing to prove by hiding it any longer, every question the Galactic throne had been declining to ask for a decade received its answer. The Commission has my files. They have the Harbinger's log. They have Cavalcanti's report and my field transmissions and Voss Shira's 9 assessments and the Qadiran session transcript and the compacts, Drawl communique, and 30 years of subsequent record. What they asked me to provide today was the thing the documents cannot hold, which is what it felt like to be present when an institution finally ran out of the distance it had been putting between itself and something it did not want to understand. It felt like watching clarity arrive, and watching everything that had preferred not to be clear begin, slowly and irrevocably, to come apart at the places where it had never been as solid as it appeared. I have been speaking for 2 hours. I believe that is the record. I have nothing to add.